Hello, welcome to day 2 of the Creation Care Pathway of the 2020 ACU Summit. My name is Jim Carpenter. I have the privilege of being the guide for this pathway, and I want to thank you all for joining with us this evening. Now, our first speaker tonight is Dodd Galbreath. Dodd is the founding director and an associate professor of sustainability at Lipscomb University. He's traveled throughout the United States, as well as extensively in Europe and in China, studying sustainability of natural resources and urban and energy practices. He's also provided counseling services for education, business, government, and nonprofit clients. This evening, Dodd is going to be speaking to us on the topic of Christians and climate change. So Dodd, thank you for being here, taking this time, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate that. I'm very excited to be here tonight, and particularly excited to have a chance to share. I'm very excited to have a chance to talk about this topic of climate change. You know, this is not exactly the most dynamic topic and exciting topic to talk about. We've all heard of the news over and over again. But it certainly is polarizing, and it certainly is a topic that I think gives Christians and gives the church an opportunity that I'm going to try to convey tonight. It's very similar to what we convey to our students. I manage a graduate program at Lipscomb University, and so I have students that range anywhere from 21 to 62, exactly that right now. And my goal is not only to help them find a profession that allows them to live out their God-given abilities and to prosper and to share that with others, but also to share our faith that God has a plan for the environment, and that God may have a plan that the church can play a role in regard to climate change. So that top phrase there really kind of summarizes specifically what I want to emphasize, and that is, I think we have a chance to glorify God by embracing creation in a new way, but by acting unconventionally. And I'll explain more about that in a minute. So the outline for tonight's discussion is exactly what it is here on the screen. We're going to briefly touch on biblical foundations. I've actually dropped the S from that. We're going to talk about a biblical foundation. We're going to talk about psychology. We're going to visit briefly with some unconventional, quote, conservative climate leaders. And we're also going to talk about briefly ways that unconventional church practice has already been carried out by other people of the Christian faith to address climate change and to engage climate change within our Christian culture and within our actual physical footprints of our churches. And then I want to propose to you that what we have an opportunity to do tonight is to rebrand God and God's designs to glorify God to people who care deeply about the environment and who care and who have a concern about climate change and care about how we deal with it, as a way to reach them, to expand the kingdom, and to show them God in a way that perhaps they haven't seen God before. So certainly not trying to recreate the perfect God or rebrand the perfect God, but present him in a way that people can see him in a way that maybe they might not have embraced in the past. And then we'll talk about next steps. So the biblical foundation that I'd like to kind of touch on, and I had a friend of mine, a Christian environmental leader, shared this with me when I started this program, actually here at Lipscomb. And it really meant a lot to me. It comes from Romans 1:20. But to paraphrase it, it basically means that creation exists as God's fingerprints, God's living presence, as God's sort of microscope to the way he thinks and the way he is approaching our world. The amazing designs that have been fashioned to make this planet function without us having to pay an electric bill or to maintain anything until we get involved in it. But more importantly, since God's eternal power and divine nature are visible to us in Scripture, but invisible to us physically, it gives us, in a sense, an opportunity to help people see our living God in a way that that perhaps they can't rationalize away. Some of these things are too amazing to be accidents, and certainly too fundamentally beautiful to be something we cannot bring ourselves to be in awe of. It's easy to be in awe of creation, as these three images here show. The image on the left is actually a sea dragon. It's actually a seahorse that looks like a plant. I first ran across this in the Chattanooga, Tennessee Aquarium, and I thought, man, if creation doesn't beam God's amazing ingenuity and the innovation of design, I don't know what does. But we're all in awe of the night sky, the solar system, the stars that we see, and we are often, I guess, unaware of the complexity that's behind it. And to help us kind of jump right into this discussion of climate change, often when I'm talking to my fellow Christians about climate change and sustainability, they often ask me, is that real? And I usually start with a fundamental aspect of how we measure things, and that is that every element that exists on our periodic table has mass. It's measurable. Carbon, which is the element and the atom that makes up CO2, has mass, and therefore we can measure it. And one of the things that we teach in technical education about sustainability is that energy and matter moves from one place to another. We usually use simple stock and flow diagrams like this to help a lot of graduate students who've never had science before, who are coming to learn how to integrate sustainability and science into their businesses and into their future, into their other professions that don't have anything to do with the environment, but that affect the environment, that can benefit from the environment. We use these diagrams to help people understand that matter and energy flows in and out of reservoirs in these systems or cycles. We've all heard of the water cycle. We've all heard of different types of environmental functions where the tides flow in, the tides flow out, and nutrients move from a planter full of corn seeds and is distributed on the soil, which then is absorbed by the roots and causes the plant to grow. This is a simple explanation of matter and energy that moves from one reservoir to another. Carbon and CO2 are no different. This is a quick model of how carbon cycles across our planet. The reservoir at the top represents the atmosphere. The other boxes represent all of the generalized reservoirs of carbon, where carbon is captured by algae in the ocean at different depths in the ocean, where carbon is captured in our soil by plants, and then exchanged with the atmosphere as trees absorb carbon and decay or burned. They release carbon back up in the atmosphere. As we burn fossil fuels, we release carbon back up in the atmosphere. But the number on the left really illustrates a fundamental fact, and that is our atmosphere is made up of very little carbon. Really a tiny percentage of CO2 makes up the volume of our atmosphere, and that's a good thing, because we all know that CO2 is a heat-trapping gas. And one of the examples that I found that best explains why this matters is this illustration of the three planets, Earth, Venus, and Mercury. The picture on the right is actually a real photograph, the clearest photograph that's ever been taken on the surface of Venus. That is actually a Soviet lander that landed on the surface of Venus. After it took this photograph, it promptly burned up, because as you can see there, Venus averages about 855 degrees Fahrenheit in temperature. And the reason that is because 98% of the volume of Venus's atmosphere is CO2. So it's literally like rolling up our car windows on a hot Texas day or a hot Tennessee day. Light can get in, heat can get in, light can get out, but heat cannot get out. It's trapped. And that's what CO2 does as a gaseous envelope of our planet. So we have a tiny percentage, 0.04% of CO2 in our atmosphere. Venus has 98% carbon, CO2 in its atmosphere, and it's much hotter because of that. Notice Mercury on the left. The average temperature of Mercury is 333 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's actually an average. When one side of Mercury is facing the sun, it's much hotter than that. When the other side of Mercury is not facing the sun, it freezes. And so that's where we get that average temperature. And you would think it would be hotter because it's closer to the sun. So it really says a lot about how heat is trapped. And that's where our fundamental understanding of the greenhouse effect comes from, is based upon these actual measurements of CO2 in our atmosphere. So we switch from that sort of brief explanation of how the greenhouse effect works to this discussion of psychology in our outline. We just started a brand new course here at Lipscomb this fall for our graduate students that focuses on social science and psychology in sustainability, because we're realizing, and scientists have been telling me this for several years, particularly scientists at Vanderbilt, we know a lot of what we need to know about what's going on in the world scientifically. We don't completely understand the complexity of all of God's designs, but we understand the stocks and flows. We understand how things move back and forth. Where we're challenged is we don't know how to sell it. We don't know how to communicate in a way that doesn't polarize people. And so this is just an example of how difficult at one time it was to sell clean water in this country. The image on the left is the Cuyahoga River back when it was severely polluted. The image on the right is that same river today after it's been cleaned up. But a lot of you may remember the Cuyahoga River actually caught fire 50 times over 50 years. I think the last time they had a major fire on the river, all the nation's papers printed pictures of it burning. And that's really what led President Richard Nixon to support our new Clean Water Act. And so it tells you a lot about human nature, that if this kind of color image could not make people change the color of the water, and fires actually burning petroleum on the surface of the water 50 times in 15 years, not to mention the coloration that probably existed a lot longer prior to that. It certainly takes a lot to convince people that we have a problem before the problem gets solved. Now, I just made a major sort of semi-mistake that psychologists tell us we shouldn't do by implying that humans don't have the ability to take effective action because something that we can't change in ourselves. I just said we didn't make the decision very fast. I didn't say we couldn't change ourselves or there wasn't something we could change within ourselves. And that's what this discussion of psychology can do for our student professionals as well as for us today as we discuss this topic. So the first point is let's look at ourselves as God's creation and as beings who have the capacity to meet new challenges. We've done it all through human history. The second thing that we're encouraged to think about in terms of climate activism is to think about how do we analyze opportunities to create change? Where are the points that we can have the most leverage? Where are the places in the power structures and which groups of people do we need to engage? Well, first understand and then engage to have an impact. And then third, we always want to look to leadership. We always want to think about how leadership and social influencers affect what we're learning are the most powerful influencers and the most powerful leverage, and that's social norms. What is normal? What is particularly attractive to people because everybody's doing it. Everybody's doing this new thing, or everybody's migrating in this or in a certain direction. We've also learned that the things that we thought worked really don't work well. I almost made the mistake early on of entitling our current course that I referenced earlier as a behavior change course. Behavioral interventions have been proven over and over again by research to have very small impacts that don't last. Educational campaigns, running ads, putting up posters, telling people about the problem, telling people that it's getting worse. It really doesn't move the needle very well. And climate change is probably the perfect example of something that challenging. And so what we are finding out, though, through deeper and deeper thinking about these topics is that nudges and social comparisons give us the highest effects. For example, one study showed that when you sent an electric bill to electric customers and you tell them how much energy they could save or how much money they could save, they will actually reduce their consumption for a while, and then eventually their consumption will begin to rise again. And in that same study, when they repeated putting that information on the bill, comparing them to their neighborhood, their broader neighborhood, again, they got some progress, they got some change in energy use, but slowly it started working its way backwards again. The thing that had the most sustainable and the highest impact were when they did these comparisons between individual neighbors of the same street or the same grouping of homes, and then they got a much more sustainable outcome. Because people are affected by how they perceived by other people, and they're affected by those nudges, those 3 stages of information that help make it more sustainable. So, but fundamentally, there are no silver bullets. A combination of behavior strategies such as communication about social norms and making it financially interesting are more effective than any one of those alone. And these interactions between these 3 are where they say we have the greatest opportunity. And of course, their other recommendations include very thoroughly analyzing why things are working. And then, of course, doing what we're doing tonight, bringing multiple disciplines together from different fields to solve the problem, like having psychology be taught in a sustainable science class, as we're doing in our graduate program. The other thing that's really exciting, and this kind of gets back to the point of not discounting our ability to adapt and to react to opportunities to deal with climate change, are these 2 issues of self-efficacy and hope. Self-efficacy is basically the belief that we can improve our ability to master change and to turn to successful role models, to receive encouragement, to teach each other strategies that help us deal with the pain of change. But hope in particular is the motivational force that involves believing that we can get there. Focusing on information, focusing on actions, focusing on examples of actions like I'm going to show you tonight. Teaching each other the connections between the things that sustain us when we hit a shock or when we have stresses. That's the definition of resilience. And appreciating God's design as one of those big shock absorbers that we can incorporate into what we're doing. So this hope theory in particular is something we don't want to leave too fast. We really want to dwell on this quite a bit because we want to create sufficient awareness of the seriousness of the risk to motivate action. We want to create awareness that we have the capacity to do it, and we want to be dependent upon hope that we do have this opportunity to change a direction that is becoming more and more self-evident, as Thomas Jefferson noted one time. Now, the one I left out before I make this switch to conservative climate leaders, and this is kind of a good segue, is this concept of empathy. And I did not include many articles about this because I knew I wouldn't have time to cover all these points. But one of the things we started studying in this new class is the effect of trauma and the history of trauma on human beings. I grew up in a rural area, and you probably noticed the book Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance is behind me, which is not a perfect book, but I related to a lot of what he said because I grew up in rural America and I saw a lot of trauma behavior in people. And trauma is something that evokes empathy, that evokes understanding of someone's difficulty or someone's difficulty in coping with challenge. And we've got a lot of folks out there who just don't believe that climate change is real, that are fearful of losing oil and coal as a dependable source of cheap energy, fearful of losing a way of life, machinery that runs on diesel fuel, or that fuels their favorite dual truck to go to a horse show when they want to, or to run their boat up and down the water. So we're going to be thinking more about this concept of why we react so harshly to some of these things. Some of them are based in trauma, some are based in histories of how we've developed as human beings. And for that, we turn to leaders to help us understand how to be empathetic towards each other. And so here's just 3 brief examples of people that I've encountered. And you're probably wondering why I have a building on the left, but I hope you Texans will recognize the building on the left. That's President George W. Bush's presidential library. That is a LEED Platinum facility, which means it meets the highest standard known in America prior to some of the more European style building standards that we have since adopted, like passive house design and the living building challenge. LEED Platinum is a highly super energy efficient building. And President Bush built this building as a model, not of his past presidency, but of his vision for the future and of his desire to be projected into the future as someone who thought practically about taking care of God's creation. I'll admit he was not a supporter of the Paris Climate Agreement, but Donald Rumsfeld, his Secretary of Defense, was the first Secretary of Defense to begin to green up buildings, because the Department of Defense happens to be the largest purchaser of energy in the world. So they quietly went about lowering the cost of energy during their administration and raising the opportunity for the taxpayers to benefit from having to pay those high bills by being more efficient in their use of defense facilities and defense equipment. The gentleman on the top right is Representative Bob Inglis. He used to be a representative in the most conservative district in South Carolina, which arguably may be the most conservative state in the country. And Representative Inglis had, I think he had received 95+% on all of the various conservative voting record rating systems. But one day his son came to him and said, "Dad, you're about to lose my vote. I'm going to be here when things seem to be getting more difficult to deal with in regard to our climate and these strange weather events. I would at least like you to look into what you believe and why you believe it, and to possibly rethink your position." And so he went to Australia, and he went to I think Greenland and Iceland, traveled all over the world. But it was a Christian biologist on a coral reef that actually changed his whole paradigm and his whole thinking about sustainability. And today he has started an organization called Republic EN, which stands for Republicans for the Environment. And he is leading a charge as a former Republican congressman from South Carolina to deal with climate change using Republican principles, reducing taxes on one thing and raising taxes that will be temporary on another, like carbon. You probably also know Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, who is a Texan from Texas Tech University, who is considered to be a climate evangelist, who talks frequently about the intersect between faith and climate change. She has written she's been a co-author for sections of the international climate reports that have been documenting concerns about climate change for several years. And she is an active scientist, atmospheric scientist, who is based in the political science department. So she's working on some of the same dynamics that we've been trying to integrate in our curriculum concerning how to talk to people and how to sell this concept of sustainability. So you probably weren't thinking quite exactly about the same way that I was in terms of these examples. I hope these are influential in terms of people who are showing us the way. So I want to turn now to unconventional church practice, and I'm just going to kind of touch on these real briefly. But basically, I heard about a church in Schönau, Germany, or Schönau, Germany. I've been told by Germans who work in companies here in America, I butchered that word, but it's a little bitty village, about 1,900 people in the Bavarian region of Black Forest region of Southwest Germany. And I had to take an overnight train and had to rent a car to drive through the countryside. I got lost several times and to find this little town. And it was a church covered in solar panels. And matter of fact, the citizens there had all banded together to buy their local electric utility. This was all catalyzed by the Chernobyl crisis, the nuclear fallout that rained down on Europe. Really scared the people in this little village. And they bought their local utility. And now today, they sell electric power to 130,000 customers, these 1,900 shareholders, and it's 95% renewable energy. And if you go to America, this is what you'll see today. You'll see churches who are embracing the opportunity to take buildings that often are largely vacant most of the week and to put energy on the roof that takes electrons right into the building that reduces their energy costs. And these are all faiths that you can imagine are doing this. I just thought it was fascinating the way that they're doing it, the way that they're rebranding this concept of climate action as part of their faith and as part of their facilities. And in some cases, you know, we all know about the mega churches. They do mega things with their solar panels as well. And I don't know if you've ever thought of it, those of you who are listening out there, but you know, God created the best nuclear reactor in the world, but you might not have known that God uses nuclear fusion, which atoms are combined to release energy, whereas our nuclear power splits an atom, which creates enormous waste that creates enormous difficulty. It actually takes anywhere from 5 to 10 years just for the thrown away fuel rods to cool off, which also means we have to run lots of water over them, which makes the water radioactive during those years. And then it takes 1,000 years for that radioactivity to completely safely disappear. That's a maintenance bill that somebody's going to be paying for our nuclear reactor for the next 1,000 years. Whereas God's nuclear reactor puts out energy that we can absorb in solar panels. So I'm going to leave you with this, and I'm going to have to kind of go through these a little bit quick, primarily because I want to leave you with lots of examples of God's amazing design and hopefully attempt to rebrand how perhaps some of us view climate-friendly practices, because these are all inspired by God's designs, by God's design of the planet. And so, for example, you know, being an academic, I've got to define what mimicry is. If we're going to mimic something from God, we need to realize it's going to be a superficial resemblance. You know, that's from Merriam-Webster. The biomimicry folks who originally came up with this concept basically define it as an innovation that seeks solutions to what we need using the tested patterns of the planet, the tested patterns that God put into place and put into motion. And so part of what's amazing about this is that, for example, there was a high-speed train. I was showing this to my daughter this afternoon. There's a high-speed train in Japan that had a blunt nose. This is the nose that was fixed. That as it was going into tunnels, it was compressing air and it was creating sonic booms on the other side so loud that it was disturbing people and shaking windows. And they had to slow the train down, which meant they carried fewer people, they burned more fuel. The engineer was a birder and had seen this kingfisher diving into the water very aerodynamically. And if you'll Google Scottish public television, you can find a great video about this kingfisher. The first part of its body hits the water just seamlessly. and it goes underwater, grabs a fish, and it flies out of the water by flapping its wings until it gets into the air. And they put this geometry on the front of this train, and it stopped the sonic booms and reduced the fuel efficiency by the fuel waste by 30%. Other scientists are mimicking God's design of lotus leaves that are basically self-cleaning, and they've created a paint that has a texture that mimics that lotus leaf, and it creates self-cleaning buildings with that paint. Other scientists are mimicking the movement of bull kelp in the tides, and like you'd find it in Monterey Bay in California, and they're generating electricity with it. Others are looking at the transfer of energy inside of our planet. This is, of course, a theoretical mimicry of God's design for the recycling of rock and for the spreading centers that occur in our oceans and closing basins that occur in our oceans as ocean basins get wider and as ocean basins close at the growth of a fingernail. All of that is being done because hot rock rises when it becomes less dense. Gravity has less force on it. Cold rock falls, and it creates convection. And this sort of walking floor, those of you who are in the grain industry may know what I'm talking about there. This walking floor allows the tectonic plates of our planet to move and shift around. But more importantly, it teaches us about how energy is trapped and insulated by water and by rock. And this design is applied to, this is a cutaway of a tankless water heater. It's applied to passive house design using concrete walls and concrete floors to absorb energy and release energy the way the planet releases energy into the ocean and onto the continents and through volcanoes if you want to make energy come out that fast. And this image here shows the house on the right. This is the passive design. So this house on the right is only leaking energy in that little red spot where the window happens to have a little heat leak. The house on the left is a more traditionally designed home that's leaking heat like a sieve, copying God's designs. And then they can scale it up to transfer heat from deep in the earth to a circuit of heat in Vienna, Austria. This is a concept for a geothermal system that they were considering there at one time. And then when they apply it this is actually Vienna itself, when they apply it to a building, this is the building that replaced the former OPEC headquarters. It is the first commercial passive design building. Notice all the concrete and notice all the windows that let sunlight in. This building is much more energy efficient than a traditional building because of its thermal mass, again, copying the geosphere dynamics of God's design. And then when we scale it back down to a house, we end up creating thicker walls. This probably looks like an adobe wall for those of you in the Southwest. 18-inch wall. This is an actual building or home in West Lebanon, New Hampshire. This is a home we visit with my students every year. It has no energy bill. It actually sells energy back to the grid because it holds most of the energy inside of its footprint. It's so well insulated. And it was built in a factory. It's beautiful on the inside. And then, we can also mimic God's design of water. Oddly enough, you could put all of the water in the entire world in one large marble there that you see perched on the United States. Now that looks freakishly inaccurate, primarily because it's the mass of the planet that makes that amount of water look so small. But this is from the United States Geological Survey, the best scientist in the world. So it's highly accurate. But I don't know if you can see that smallest dot. There's actually 3 dots there. Or 3 objects there. The blue big marble, the tiny blue marble, and then there's a tiny blue dot. That tiny blue dot represents by volume all of the fresh water on the planet in lakes and rivers. So the mass of the planet makes it look really tiny. We have a lot of water, but by volume, in comparison to the planet, it's pretty small. So God designed a tree to slow water down and to make a raindrop hit every leaf and every limb and every spongy piece of bark And we call this detention. When we build detention ponds, we build these open basins that catch water very uncreatively. God creates a tree that not only detains it in big trees, but all the trees underneath it and all the shrubs underneath it. And then water gets retained by the humus layer and gets used by that same plant and breathed back up into the atmosphere as a gas. So when we apply this design of this by volume, limited fresh water to our corporate landscapes, to the places where we work and learn and relax, to factories, that's Ford Motor Company, Green Roof, to landscapes around manufacturing centers, to the roof of the Gap headquarters in California, which actually they no longer hear airplanes flying over the building because it's so well insulated with native grasses on the roof. All the way to mimicking that retention layer that I was talking about earlier. This is 1,000 gallons pouring out of a fire truck on a parking lot, which normally, that's the mayor of Nashville, by the way, in that yellow tie or orange tie. Normally he'd be running, but because they designed this parking lot to absorb water, they're not having to run away. So people who like to wear high heel shoes with those wide openings in the toes on a rainy day, their feet don't get wet on this parking lot unless 1,000 gallons gets poured out near their feet. And I don't know if any of you all have been to Nashville and been to Pancake Pantry, but I asked the owners why they installed this porous area on the sidewalk. It wasn't a city project. The owners of this building did it, and they said they didn't want their customers' feet to get so wet while they're waiting in line to go into this very popular restaurant. People do stand in line on rainy days, and this is what keeps water off the sidewalk, gives water a place to go. So this is a building in Paris, France, that is literally mimicking a forest and a mountainside. That's me and my children there in the bottom of that photograph. This is a building in Japan that mimics a mountain. There's lots of Bible verses about mountains, right? And when you kind of look at that building in profile, you can see it has a skin using plants, living beings that God designed and created from scratch, and has our building inside of it. And it looks like a park. And on. You can just keep taking it to bigger and bigger levels. This is, I think, the Science Institute in Indonesia. The last thing I will leave you with is, I know in Texas it gets really hot. For those of you who are in Texas, and I know we've got folks from all over the country. I think today it's actually really cold. Y'all may have a little snow, so I kind of defeated my point. But think of Africa. If we're going to mimic the atmosphere and think about how air moves, hot air moves around the planet, the image on the right is actually a more accurate image of how the air how our atmosphere, or the lower atmosphere, expands at the equator because air is warmer, and contracts at the poles because the air is cooler. If you apply this convection activity down to the scale of a termite mound on the left, and look at how air convects in a termite mound in Africa, then you can apply it to a building. This is a shopping mall in Africa that cycles and convects hot air rises, cold air falls, hot air rises during the day, and cold air is captured at night, and it is cycled to the building, which enormously reduces their air conditioning bill in this shopping mall in Africa. That's beautiful, and it's mimicking God's designs. So next steps. If we're inspired by this, these are the questions or the points that I want to leave with you. We can share these research strategies with church leaders. They're busy, they're stressed. If we want to integrate embracing God's creation and God's designs into our buildings and into our daily theological discussions in these buildings, we're going to need to do it in a way that's not going to polarize people. So we've got tools to have conversations and to deliver the practices. In the Christian Scholars Conference this year, but particularly I think a year and a half from now, it's going to focus, I think, specifically on creation. And so we have chances to do what one of our Lipscomb Bible faculty talked about last night, a theocentric approach to creation care. Or work out the language of our theology and go back to the Bible and try to figure out, how we present what God intended us to understand about his word in regard to creation care and apply it. And then the question I want to leave with you is that, do you think it's possible for climate practices to glorify God? It probably depends upon that first item and the second item. It probably depends upon our individual actions. I know as a professor of sustainability, I drive a partially electric car. I get first 50 miles are all electric on my car. I have solar panels on my home. I have rain gardens in my yard. I've planted tree after tree, bush after bush, about 700. I'm not doing that to be pious. I'm doing it because I have an individual obligation to learn from my own actions and my own behaviors, and so that I can share it more effectively with others and live out my faith. And I'm not doing that perfectly, but I do hope that I've left you with something to think about so that we can help others join our kingdom of God. Thank you.
Well, Dodd, you got one message from your colleague. I don't know if you're looking at the chat.
Yeah, I did. I saw John Mark's name.
Well, he says, what would you say is the highest priority in terms of individual engagement?
It's energy, and well, I take that back. It's how we act socially in the institutions that have the most capacity to bring about the kind of change we want and that we need. And I'll put it like this: when I do my carbon footprint and what we call my Earth impact footprint, if I'd done it before I started doing all the things that I've learned while I've been active in teaching sustainability and reading and traveling the world, if I'd done it before then, I think my planetary impact would have been using something like 4.3 planets. My consumption would represent deficit spending, like the federal debt. I'd be spending more money than I'd be bringing in, about 4 times as much. When I put solar on my home and started recycling things that are actually recyclable, plastic's not recyclable, by the way, and avoided buying things that had a lot of embodied sort of waste in it, I got it down to 2.3 planets. And I asked myself, am I going to have to go off the grid somewhere and leave my family, because my teenagers are not going to go with me, and probably not my wife either, as much as we appreciate each other. And what I realized after I studied some more is that there's societal infrastructure that we're all a part of, in addition to the footprint that I'm not closing the gap on, which I frankly can't close the gap on because I'm part of a societal framework that only society can close the gap on. And so we're going to need to speak up in our churches. We're going to need to act a certain way in our homes, and it starts first with energy. We desperately need to make the shift from fossil fuel to renewables, not strictly because of climate change, but because one of our sets of grandkids out there in the future, grandkids, great-grandkids, great-great-grandkids, is not going to have cheap fuel to grow food with. It's a savings account that we're spending down, and it's a deficit spending behavior. So we have deficit spending behavior for coal and oil that is a trust fund, a big trust fund that we've been spending down every year, shrinking it. And one day it'll still be there. It'll just be really expensive because supply and demand will make it expensive. It'll be rare and it'll be expensive. And I don't know where food's going to come from if we don't have a solution before then, because a lot of food is grown with a lot of diesel fuel and gasoline, and manufactured and distributed with those fuels. So that alone to me is enough of a catalyst to think about an energy transition. So how we engage our institutions politically and otherwise for energy is the first priority.
Thank you. And the Christian aspect of that, I think we need to think about as well. And I'll actually be talking a little bit about that tomorrow. but we talk about just reducing our carbon footprint. And by the way, Dodd, I have my students in one of my classes do that footprint exercise as well, and they have to answer some questions after doing it. One of those questions is, of course, tell me 5 things that you can personally do to reduce your footprint. But then I say, tell me 5 things that are out of your control, and how can we do these things? How can we make these changes if you can't personally do it? And these are, as you mentioned, structural changes in our society. We have a bigger footprint just because we live in the United States, and we have paved roads, and we have all these other things as part of our societal structure. So what can we do to make changes for that?
I agree.
And I think as Christians, we need to talk about this and talk about food production in terms of what are we leaving for the future for our great-grandchildren, and particularly for people in other parts of the world that are already struggling. What are they going to do when we run out of cheap energy?
Yeah.
And what's our Christian responsibility to them?
Yeah. And what's our Christian opportunity? I mean, it's we're living in a time right now when there are many reasons. You don't have to talk about climate change to discourage someone from going to church with you because of what you believe or what you care about. There's all kind of reasons to get polarized these days. So the concept of being comfortable with engaging in a creation care approach in our churches and in our homes to attract non-Christians, who care about the environment into a kingdom dialogue, is a real struggle. But, human history has shown that we have overcome challenge after challenge after challenge, and we have God on our side as Christians. And so it's really just a matter of sorting that out. But, if you're looking for kind of easy, kind of short-term things, it really is, more energy efficient appliances. It'll save you money. They'll pay for themselves. LED light bulbs will pay for themselves very, very quickly. I think 1.5 years is the latest thing I saw. I remember when I saw an LED floodlight on a store shelf in Walmart for $85. Those were the first ones that hit the shelves. And then 5 years later, they were like $35. And then a year after that, they were like 18. And I was at Home Depot one night and I saw this 70-year-old man buying these LED lights and paying $18 a piece for them back when they were that expensive. They're much cheaper than that now. And I asked the Home Depot guy, I said, why is he spending $18 a light bulb? And he said, because he doesn't want to fall off his ladder, because you only got to put it up there once. In 15 years, it's going to still be there. So there's really practical reasons for doing this. Hospitals are going to all LED lights because they don't have to change 10,000 light bulbs, every few months. There's lots and lots of reasons to make these transitions that are practical.